We all know how difficult to have academics on-site and off-site. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this academic event hosted by Association of NBE accredited hospitals. It's always a pleasure to be associated with NBE, and I'm thankful to Dr. Alexander Thomas sir also. And I would like to introduce you for today's speaker, who is our eminent urologist. He's our senior consultant and one of the most proliferating urologists in our hospital. So his name is Dr. Jagdish Kaushik, and he'll be having the class on applied anatomy of renal system, which is very important for the DNB residents, because most of the classes what we are taking every Tuesdays is on applied anatomy, applied physiology, applied biochemistry on basic sciences, which is a part and parcel of your DNB program. So over to you, Dr. Jagdish, please start.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. So I'm Dr. Jagdish. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Association of National Board Accredited Institutes for giving me this opportunity. Also, I would like to thank Dr. Srinath for the kind introduction and accepting to moderate this session. So, what is the renal system? The renal system is basically the urinary system. It consists of the kidneys, ureters, bladder, and the urethra. In this presentation, we will look at the anatomy of each organs and relevant applied anatomy for each aspect of the organ. The function of the urinary system is basically to eliminate waste from the body, regulate blood volume and blood pressure, control levels of electrolytes and metabolites, and regulate blood pH. So moving on to kidneys. This is a simplified diagram of the embryology of the embryological development of the urinary system. So this is a longitudinal section of the embryo. This image is not taken in a single time frame. It is the development process that it depicts the development process that happens between the 4th week of embryo life to the 8th week. So first, we look at the development of the upper urinary tract. The kidney develops in 3 phases, 2 transitory phase and 1 final product. The first phase would be development of pronephros, which starts early in the 4th week of gestational life. And then by the end of the 4th week, it again degenerates completely. The function of the pronephros is basically to form a map for the development of mesonephros. Mesonephros is the second transitory phase. Unlike the pronephros, which is just a rudimentary structure, the mesonephros actually acts as a immature functioning kidney. The mesonephros is made up of the mesonephric duct, the mesonephric tubules, and the surrounding mesenchymal tissue known as nephrogenic cord. So with time, what happens is the ureteric bud branches off the mesonephric duct and branches off to form the ureteric bud, and the sacral portion of the nephrogenic cord and surrounds the ureteric bud to form metanephric mesenchyme. This metanephros, this is called as metanephros, which is ultimately the final product or the adult version of the kidney. From the metanephric mesenchyme, we develop the nephrons, and from the ureteric bud, we develop the ureter and the pelvic calyceal system. This is the embryology of the upper tract simplified. Looking at the embryology of the lower urinary tract, cloaca, which is the common outlet chamber for the embryo, is cleaved into 2 halves by a development of a septum called as urorectal septum along this plane, which divides the cloaca into 2 portions. Anteriorly, it is called as the primitive urogenital sinus, and posteriorly it becomes the anorectum. The primitive urogenital sinus again is divided into 2 parts. The distal part becomes the phallic part, which forms the penis and the urethra in males, and posteriorly the anorectum is outlet for the alimentary canal. The proximal part of the urogenital sinus becomes the bladder, and the allantois gets obliterated to become the urachus. So this is a simplified animation again of how the embryonal development happens. So this is how the initial pronephros disintegrates, and then the mesonephros forms, and then you have the ureteric bud arising from the mesonephric duct, and then your metanephros forms. Interestingly, the kidney forms in the pelvic portion, and the mesonephros becomes the gonads, which eventually descends down into the scrotum and in males, and the kidney ascends up into the retroperitoneum. This second animation is how the sorry, one second. Yeah, the second animation shows how the cleavage of the urorectal septum happens, and it meets the perineal body, dividing the posterior anorectum and the anterior urogenital sinus. So, coming to the introduction of kidneys. Kidneys, as we all know, is a retroperitoneal organ. It ascends from S1 to S2 to its adult position T12 to L3. The right kidney is relatively lower, owing to accommodating the liver. The medial border presents as a concavity called as hilum. This concavity is called as hilum, and the hilum houses the renal vein, the renal arteries, and the renal pelvis retroperitoneally. Posteriorly. So the anterior to posterior relationship is renal vein, renal artery, and then the renal pelvis. In adults, the kidney measures around 10 centimeters in length, 5 centimeters in breadth, and 5.5 centimeters in width. So now let's look at the some of the applied anatomy with respect to embryological development of the kidney. The kidney during its embryonal development ascends from sacral part to its adult position in thoracolumbar region. During ascent, what happens? The kidney rotates 90 degrees medially, when the kidney develops in the pelvis, the ventral surface, the renal pelvis faces ventrally, and as kidney ascends, there is also rotation happening, and the renal pelvis finally ends up facing medially. This is the normal rotation of the kidney. Some congenital disorders can cause abnormal rotation. There can be a non-rotation of the kidney where the renal pelvis in the final stage stays in the ventral portion of the ventral portion, or there can be an incomplete rotation, or there can be a hyper-rotation wherein the kidney rotates beyond the point where the renal pelvis faces medially to face posteriorly. There can also be lateral reverse rotation, where finally the renal pelvis will face laterally and the renal parenchyma faces medially. The other developmental anomalies are renal agenesis. The kidneys during development for sporadic reasons or due to chromosomal abnormalities will not develop. Bilateral absence of kidneys is not compatible with life. During the embryonal development, there is oligohydramnios. The embryo has Potter's facies and eventually succumbs to the absence of kidneys. Unilateral absence, the embryo develops and there is a live birth, and usually it is undetected unless it is incidentally found during later stages of the life. Renal ectopia, when the ascent of kidney does not happen, the kidney either stays in the pelvis or in the lumbar region instead of reaching its thoracolumbar adult position. This is more commonly seen on the left side. The other developmental anomaly we commonly see is the incidence is somewhere around 1 in 400 live births. Is lower pole fusion. This is fused by a isthmus, which can be parenchymatous or fibrous. What happens during ascent is, since the lower pole is fused, the inferior mesenteric artery arrests the ascent of the kidney, and it stays at around the lumbar region. And one more important point to be noted in a horseshoe kidney is there is almost always anomalous blood vessels associated with it, because when the kidney ascends, it derives first blood supply from the iliac vessels, then from the lower part of the abdominal aorta and renal vein, the IVC, and then eventually it once it reaches to regular position, it derives blood vessels. But abnormal, horseshoe kidneys can have anomalous vessels, which is especially very important to be noted during surgeries on such kidneys. Next comes supranumerary kidney. When the metanephric blastema, which we saw initially, which comes and fuses with the urethric bud, when the metanephric blastema splits into two parts, it then becomes a entity called supranumerary kidney, where there is two kidneys on the ipsilateral side. To define a kidney as a supranumerary kidney, it has to have its own encapsulated parenchyma. It should have its own collecting system and own blood supply. Now coming to orientation of the kidney, the kidney axis is not a vertically straight axis. It is the upper pole is tilted 30 degrees medially and 30 degrees posteriorly, and the lateral border is rotated 30 degrees posteriorly. So the upper pole is more closer to the midline, and the kidneys move around 3 centimeters inferiorly during inspiration. So this is again important because it happens because the kidney is attached to the diaphragm. Coming to the adjacent structures and the kidney's relationship to them, kidney is a retroperitoneal organ, like we know, and the other retroperitoneal structures like the C loop of duodenum and the tail of pancreas are in very close proximity to the kidney. The C loop of duodenum covers the hilum of the right kidney, and the tail of pancreas the hilum of the left kidney. And you have the adrenal gland sitting on as a cap on either side on the kidney, and then you have the peritoneal, intraperitoneal structures like the liver, stomach, and the small bowel overlying the kidney. And the ascending and descending colon have their peritoneal attachments in close proximity to the kidney. To access the kidney intraoperatively, the peritoneal attachment of the large bowel should be mobilized to access the kidney. Posteriorly, the 11th and 12th rib overlay the kidney. The upper half of the kidney is in close proximity to the diaphragm, and lower half of the kidney has the medial third portion of the medial third portion of the kidney has the psoas major muscle, and the ureter runs anterior to the psoas major muscle to reach the pelvis, and the middle third of the kidney on the posterior aspect is lies over the quadratus lumboris muscle, and the lateral most aspect of the posterior side has the transversus abdominis muscle behind it. So with relationship to the adjacent structures, let's look at the applied anatomy of the applied anatomy. The renal angle, which is formed by the lateral border of the erector spinae muscle and the inferior border of the 12th rib, this is otherwise known as costovertebral angle. This region it can help us elicit tenderness in this region, which is known as costovertebral angle tenderness, which often depicts pathology in the kidney. The dominant hand of the examiner is placed on this angle, and with the fist of the dominant hand, a gentle thud is given on the non-dominant hand. Eliciting pain in this region means it is the pathology is not, the pathology for the pain in this region is not muscular. Instead, it is of kidney origin. The most common conditions that have costovertebral angle tenderness are acute pyelonephritis, renal abscess. Sometimes uretropelvic junction and stone in the urethra can also have renal angle tenderness. Next is, if you look at the diagram here, the stones in the kidneys are generally, sorry, one second. Yeah, the stones in the kidneys are accessed by making a percutaneous puncture into the kidney, and the stone is the tract is dilated, and with the help of a nephroscope, the stone is fragmented. This is the gold standard management for renal calculus in current era. So to gain this access, a percutaneous puncture is made. Usually the puncture is made subcostally to avoid injury to other organs, but sometimes upper polar stones needs to be accessed through a puncture in the supracostal space. So entering the 11th supracostal space, usually there can be an injury to pleura, but there is very unlikely chance that the lung will be injured. But entering above the 11th rib can cause direct injury to the lung. It is ideal to hold the patient in an inspiratory status so that the kidney is pushed down before the puncture is made. The other entity we'll have to be wary of is presence of a retrorenal colon. Usually the colon is present anterior to the kidney. Sometimes in around 4 to 6% of patients, the large bowel can be present posterior to the kidney. So it is always important to get a cross-sectional imaging done prior to operating on a patient with renal stone disease. Next, coming on to the coverings of the kidney. The kidney has 4 layers of covering. The first layer is called the fibrous capsule, which is densely adherent to the renal parenchyma. The second layer, outside the capsule, you have the perinephric fat, and outside the perinephric fat, you have the Gerota's fascia. The Gerota's fascia, otherwise known as the renal fascia, basically consists of 2 layers. The anterior layer is called fascia of Talt, and the posterior layer is called fascia of Zucker-Kandl. The layers fuse with each other from laterally to medially, and superiorly they enclose the adrenal glands, and inferiorly the renal fascia is weakly fused around the ureter. The significance of it being weakly fused in the lower aspect, we will come to it later. Then the 4th layer is the pararenal fat, which constitutes the main portion of the retroperitoneal fat. So this is again cross-sectional imaging. This is how the this is the yellow structure is the kidney, the blue structure is the renal capsule. Surrounding it, you have your perirenal fat, and outside it, you have your renal fascia, otherwise known as the Gerota's fascia. The posterior layer and the anterior layer, they fuse close to the midline around the major vessels, and inferiorly they are not fused properly, and outside them what is in pink is the pararenal fat. So coming to the significance of the coverings of kidney. So looking I mean, if you look at this image carefully, there is a collection outside the kidney on both these images. What you see here is the collection is subcapsular, meaning it is inside the fibrous capsule, causing an indentation on the parenchymal part of the kidney. Here the collection is outside the fibrous capsule, but contained in the perirenal fat. So the significance of it is when the collection is within the fibrous capsule, if you note on the CT image, there is no violation of perirenal fat. There is compression on the renal parenchyma, which leads to development of hypertension and poorly functioning kidney. Whereas if the collection is outside the fibrous capsule, the collection does not interfere with the function of the kidney, and it is usually easier to drain. And also because the renal fascia is weakly fused below, the collection outside the outside the fibrous capsule, they can descend down into the pelvis and form a psoas abscess. And also invasion of Gerota's fascia by renal cell cancer is supposedly to have a poorer prognosis. So coming to the renal vasculature of the kidney, this is the arterial. We're going to talk about the arterial supply first. Each kidney has a single large renal artery arising from the abdominal aorta. It arises below the origin of the superior mesenteric artery between L1 and L2 vertebrae. The right renal artery arises a little lower because of the liver and is longer than the left. The right renal artery is longer because it has to course behind the aorta to reach the right kidney. The renal artery further divides into 2 branches, one larger anterior branch and small posterior branch. The posterior branch is usually single, and the larger anterior branch gives 3 to 5 segmental arteries, and these segmental arteries eventually supply the nephrons in the cortex. Now, how they supply, we'll see. The segmental artery first divides into a lobar artery, and the lobar artery then divides into an interlobar artery. The interlobar artery arcs around the renal pyramid to form the arcuate artery, and then gives off the interlobular artery. So the interlobular artery gives an afferent arteriole. Afferent arteriole enters the Bowman's capsule of the nephron to form a tuft of capillaries called the glomerulus. And the glomerulus, again from the glomerulus, once the glomerular filtration has happened, the artery exits as an efferent arteriole. This efferent arteriole again enters into the medullary part of the kidney along the renal tubules, where continuous exchange of substances happen. So the applied anatomy with relation to renal vasculature is the one of the most common anomalies seen with relation to renal arteries is the presence of accessory renal arteries. It is more commonly reported on the left side. There are up to 5 arteries seen on the accessory arteries that can be seen apart from the main renal artery on the left side. And one more very important point is the segmental arteries of the kidneys do not anastomose with each other. They are end arteries basically. So an injury or occlusion to the segmental artery can cause segmental renal infarction. Coming to the venous supply, there is again, as we saw earlier, the anterior to posterior relationship of the hilum is anteriorly are the renal vein, next to it posteriorly is the renal artery, and finally you have the renal pelvis. The left renal vein is significantly longer than the right, since again it has to course over the aorta. This is ideal, and this left kidney is preferred for donor nephrectomy owing to this factor. The left renal vein also has multiple branches that it receives. One is the gonadal vein, multiple tributaries, and the second is the adrenal vein, and the third one is the lumbar vein. The right renal artery does not receive these branches. The lumbar and the adrenal veins directly drain into the IVC. The venous drainage, though it closely correlates with the arterial supply, unlike the arterial supply, it has extensive collaterals. Coming to the applied anatomy of the renal vein sometimes can get entrapped between the superior mesenteric artery and the abdominal aorta. When the angle between the superior mesenteric artery and the abdominal aorta is narrow, this causes compression of the left renal vein and causes development of varices over the testicular vein and the proximal renal vein. This compression may lead to a syndrome called nutcracker syndrome, where the patient experiences vague abdominal pain, hematuria. Coming to the applied anatomy again of the renal artery. The renal artery, especially the posterior segmental branch, if it passes anterior to the ureter, or if there is an aberrant lower polar crossing vessel, this can cause impaired drainage of the ureter, causing the pelvis to become distended. This is known as pelviureteric junction obstruction. This is corrected by surgery called dismembered pyeloplasty, where the ureter is detached from the renal pelvis and they're both brought anterior to the crossing vessel and resutured. Next is the line of Brodel. It is called Brodel's line. Otherwise, it is a longitudinal avascular line between the area supplied by the anterior segmental arteries and the posterior segmental artery. This area is relatively avascular and is utilized for surgery wherein the parenchyma of the kidney has to be opened to operate. This is roughly around 1 centimeter posterior to the lateral border of the kidney, and this incision is utilized to remove especially large stones from the pelvic ileal system. Coming to the gross renal structure, the renal structure is has mainly 2 portions, the cortex and the inner medulla. It is a 2-tone parenchyma. The cortex is lighter and the medulla is darker. We'll go through these in the next image. So the outer cortex is usually lighter and the inner medulla is darker. The cortex extends into the medulla, dividing the medullary tissue into triangular pyramidal tissues. These are called renal pyramids, and the medullary extension of the cortex is called as columns of Burton, otherwise known as a renal column. each renal pyramid drains into a minor calyx, and the point at which it drains into the minor calyx is known as renal papilla. So the importance of parenchyma is the parenchyma is the functional part of the kidney. In a normal person, when you do a contrast and CT, you see a good parenchyma. But when a patient has suffered from insult of ureteric obstruction for a long time, secondary to a stone or a PUJ obstruction, the parenchyma eventually takes the brunt of the insult and thins out, and this kidney becomes non-functional and can be a source of infection and needs to be removed. This is how it looks. A healthy kidney looks on an ultrasound image, and this is a kidney with thinned out parenchyma. Also, one more important aspect with relation to cortex medulla is tumors that are cortical, that are predominantly exophytic and small tumors, meaning renal cell cancer, can be removed by salvaging the kidney. Just the portion of the kidney, as in a wedge of kidney along with the tumor, can be removed, and the kidney can be resutured. If the tumor invades the medullary portion, or if the tumor thrombus extends into renal vessels, then the chances of, especially if it doesn't involve the renal veins, and if it is just invading the medulla, the chances of doing a partial nephrectomy becomes very minimal. And if it invades the renal vein, there is no option but to remove the kidney in toto, and part of the renal vein completely, and part of the IVC may also have to be removed. Coming to the microscopic structure of the kidney, the microscopic structure mainly involves the nephrons. The nephrons is the functional unit of the kidney. Around 400,000 to 1.2 million nephrons are found in each kidney. The nephron is made up of renal corpuscles and renal tubules. So this is the structure of this is a wedge portion of the kidney taken. This is the outer capsule, and this is the renal papilla. So on the cortex, you have your renal corpuscles arranged. The renal tubules extend into the medulla. If you look at the renal corpuscle, it is made by the afferent arteriole entering, and then the glomerulus, and outer covering is called as the Bowman's capsule. We'll have a look at the renal corpuscle in detail. The renal corpuscle, the afferent, again, it is adjacent to the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Juxtaglomerular apparatus is is formed by interaction between the distal convoluted tubule and the afferent and efferent arterioles. It helps in regulating the glomerular filtration, and also helps in maintaining the blood pressure. So the renal corpuscle has a tuft of capillaries known as glomerulus, and it is lined by podocytes which facilitate glomerular filtration to happen. Once glomerular filtration happens, that passes down into the proximal convoluted tubule. The average GFR of a normal person is around 90 to 120 milliliters per minute of body surface area. So there are once the glomerular filtration happens inside the glomerulus, inside the Bowman's capsule, it passes down into the proximal convoluted tubule, and through the proximal convoluted tubule, it descends down into the medulla through loop of Henle. Again, it ascends up into the cortex, into the distal convoluted tubule, and finally the distal convoluted tubule joins the collecting tubule, and this drains into the renal papilla through the papillary duct. So to simplify, the Bowman's capsule has the function of glomerular filtration, the proximal convoluted tubule has the function of tubular reabsorption, and the distal convoluted tubule has the function of tubular secretion, and the collecting tubule has the function of excretion. So the significance of knowing the anatomy of nephron neurologically at least is to know where the diseases of nephrons kidney arises from. The disease of kidney generally arises, as in the disease of nephrons generally arise from either the glomeruli or the tubules. Glomerular diseases are like diabetes nephropathy, glomerulonephritis, IgA nephropathy. The renal tubular diseases are acute tubular necrosis, renal tubular acidosis, and polycystic kidney disease. Another important factor that we have to notice, the tubular cells are all made up of labile cells, Unlike the glomerulus is made up of permanent cells. So tubular insult, especially in a case of acute tubular necrosis, the kidneys can recover, but glomerular injury is permanent and glomerular diseases never recover. So diseases of nephron are diagnosed using image-guided renal biopsy. Also, the histopathological variants of renal cell carcinoma arises from different segments of the nephron. So coming to pelvic calyceal system, the collecting tubules of the nephrons drain into the papillary duct of the renal papilla, as we saw earlier, which is in contact with the minor calyx. This minor calyx and then drains into a major calyx. The major calyx drains into renal pelvis, and the renal pelvis into the ureter. This is an image of a retrograde pyelogram where intraoperatively, usually we use this modality to inspect the structure of the pelvic calyceal system. There are three calyceal groups: the upper group, middle group, and the lower group. But one more interesting fact is the minor calyx can either be simple, meaning it drains only one papilla, or compound, where it more drains 2 or 3 papilla. Compound calyces are a rule in upper calyceal group. It means it is almost present in the upper calyx, and it is rare in the middle calyceal group, and it is common in the lower calyceal group. Renal pelvis then joins the ureter at the pelviureteric junction. So this is an image of the kidney where the pelvic calyceal system is dilated. This is a CT image, and this is how it looks on an ultrasound scan. So with this, we come to the end of applied anatomy of the kidney. Next, we'll move on to the applied anatomy of ureter. So the ureter is a retroperitoneal structure. It is around 22 to 30 centimeters long, around 1.5 to 6 millimeters in diameter. The course of throughout its course, it's a retroperitoneal structure. It descends on the anterior surface of the psoas major muscle, and it runs along the lateral tips of the transverse process of the lumbar vertebra. On crossing anterior to the common iliac vessels at its bifurcation, it runs along the lateral pelvic wall to enter the bladder. So the ureter is divided into 3 parts basically. The proximal, radiologically it is divided into 3 parts. The proximal part is from the pelviureteric junction to the sacroiliac joint, proximal sacroiliac joint. The cranial end of sacroiliac joint, and the mid-ureter is the one that overlies the sacroiliac joint, and the distal ureter is from the caudal end of the sacroiliac joint to the bladder. One more important thing to note about the ureters is it has 3 physiological constrictions. One is the pelviureteric junction, the second is iliac vessel crossing, the third is the vesico-ureteric junction. All these 3 sites, like I said, the pelviureteric junction, the iliac vessel crossing, and the vesico-ureteric junction are all sites of stone impaction. Since the ureter diameter is around 3 mm to 6 mm, stones larger than 6 mm are are less likely to pass down spontaneously. The terminal ureter perforates the retrosar muscle to enter the bladder. This portion is called the intramural portion. It is around 1.5 to 2.5 centimeters long. It is the narrowest portion of the ureter with an average diameter of 3 to 4 millimeters. We'll again look at the intramural portion in detail when we look at the bladder. There are many ureteral anomalies like the primary obstructive megaureter, ureterocele, duplication of the ureter. But duplication of ureter is what I'm going to deal with today, because it is one of the most common congenital malformations of the urinary tract. You see the incidence of the ureteral duplication is around 1 in 125 live births. So this results from abnormalities of the ureteric bud, wherein the ureteric bud, when it arises from the mesonephric duct, arises as 2 different ducts, or the single ureteric bud has split into 2 ureteric buds. If the single ureteric bud splits into 2 ureteric buds, you have an incomplete ureteral duplication, where there is a common ureter, and then the upper and lower moiety ureters join into a common ureter. If it arises as 2 separate ureteric buds, then you have 2 complete ureteral duplication. There is a law called Weger's-Mayer law, which applies to complete ureteral duplication. wherein the upper renal moiety, that is the upper renal moiety ureter, has always an ectopic insertion, and it is almost always medial and inferior to the lower polar moiety. And the lower polar moiety has an orthotopic insertion, and it is lateral and superior to the ureter, draining the upper pole. Coming to the arteries and veins of the ureter has arterial supply in three different patterns. The proximal ureter receives blood supply medially, the mid portion supplies receives blood supply posteriorly, and the distal portion receives blood supply laterally. Medially, you have the renal artery supplying the proximal portion, and in the posterior aspect of the mid-ureter, the common iliac vessels give branches, and in the lateral aspect of the distal ureters, the superior vesical artery gives a branch. A superior vesical artery, which is a branch of internal iliac artery, gives supply to the distal ureter. Venous drainage corresponds to the arterial supply majority of the cases. Additionally, the proximal ureter can drain into gonadal veins along with the iliac veins. So, applied anatomy of the ureter. The ureter, there's a term known as water under the bridge, wherein it means the ureter always passes beneath the uterine artery and the gonadal arteries, meaning the water, that is urine, that flows under the bridge, wherein the ureter runs over the water. This is a common site of injury during gynecological procedures. Common site of injury to the ureter during a hysterectomy or pelvic surgery by a urologic surgeon. This portion of the ureter can be damaged. Extensive mobilization of the ureter may disrupt blood flow through the tiny ureteric plexus of blood vessels and cause ureteric ischemia. This ureteric ischemia can cause development of ureteral strictures. And ureter, being such a long organ, almost traveling the entirety of the abdomen, has close relationship with most of the abdominal and pelvic organs. This makes it susceptible for encroachment by inflammatory and malignant processes. Coming to the nerve supply, the sympathetic supply of the ureter is from the preganglionic fibers of T11, T12, and L1. Parasympathetic vagal fibers is supplied from the upper part to the upper part by the celiac plexus and to the lower part by Q2S4. Next, coming to the peristalsis of the ureter. The interesting point here is the nerve fibers of the ureter only conduct sensory stimuli and have little control over peristalsis of the ureter. This is seen when we remove a kidney from a donor to transplant it to a recipient. Only the vein and the artery is anastomosed to the recipient, and no neuronal connection is reattached. But in spite of that, the ureter peristalsis is present throughout, and there is no reflex. And denervated lower ureter, even in a normal person, does not cause reflex. The reason for this is peristalsis of the ureter originates from the pacemaker cells of the minor calyces. Pain and vomiting are noted in ureteric obstruction. As we saw earlier, the embryological development of the kidneys and the gonads are similar. So distension of the collecting system stimulates the renal pain fibers. This causes typical pain radiating from the loin to groin. And distension of the renal capsule may also produce nausea and vomiting, because the renal the renal capsule has shared splanchnic innervation with the intestines. Coming to the lymphatics, the left abdominal ureter drains in the left para-aortic lymph nodes. The right abdominal ureter drains in the right paracaval and the interaortocaval lymph nodes. The middle part of the ureter drains in the common iliac lymph nodes, and the distal part drains the common iliac, external iliac, and the internal iliac lymph nodes. Coming to urinary bladder. Urinary bladder is an intra-abdominal organ in children, and during puberty it migrates into the true pelvis. It is mostly an extraperitoneal organ, sharing its borders with the peritoneal cavity on its dome and part of the posterior bladder wall. The superior border of the bladder anteriorly is in continuity with the urachus, which is the obliterated median umbilical ligament. Anterior to the bladder, there's a potential extraperitoneal space known as the space of Retzius, which is utilized to access during surgeries of bladder and the prostate. This is a coronal section of the bladder. So briefly, this is the fundus of the bladder. I mean, this is the perivesical fat, and you have the adventitial layer, and then the detrusor muscle, and then you have the mucosal layer. You have bilateral ureteric orifices at this level. It is connected by the Mercier's bar, otherwise known as the interureteric ridge, and the triangle formed by the bladder neck and both the ureteric orifices is known as trigone, and the bladder then drains into the prostatic urethra and eventually into the urethra and outside. So this is a cystoscopic view of urethra. This is how, of the bladder. This is how we enter into the urethra. This is how the prostate lateral lobes are seen cystoscopically, and this is how bladder mucosa appears during cystoscopy, and this is how ureteric orifice appears. So the applied anatomy of with relation to position of the bladder is SPC insertion. SPC insertion means suprapubic catheterization. It is performed usually as an emergency procedure when patient presents with retention of urine and perurethral access to the bladder has failed for some reason, probably due to presence of a stricture or failed catheterization secondary to a false passage. So in such conditions, you'll have to pass a trocar through the anterior abdominal wall to directly hit the bladder. The landmark for passing the trocar is through an incision made 2 centimeters above the pubic symphysis. And very important thing is it should be made in a distended bladder. So prior to placing a trocar, you have to pass a needle to make sure you are seeing clear urine coming out. Only then attempt suprapubic insertion of a trocar. So if you see an undistended bladder is well within the pelvis behind the pubic symphysis, a distended bladder extends into the abdominal cavity. Next, coming on to the layers of the bladder. The bladder has basically 2 layers, superficial layers and deeper layers. The superficial layer is made up of relatively impermeable multiple layers of urothelium or transitional epithelium, and this portion is called the mucosa. This mucosa is densely adherent to the lamina propria and smooth muscle layer, which is known as a submucosal layer or the muscularis mucosa. Deeper to it, you have the detrusor muscle. The detrusor muscle is basically made up of 3 layers of muscle. One is the inner longitudinal muscle, second is the middle circular muscle, and the outermost is the outer longitudinal muscle. The innermost longitudinal muscle continues with the prostatic urethra down, and the circular muscle forms the internal sphincter, and outer longitudinal muscle posteriorly forms a strong backing for the trigone, and anteriorly it forms the puboprostatic ligaments. Knowing the layers of the bladder is very important because that is how you classify bladder tumors. The bladder tumors, if it arises from the mucosa, if it just involves the mucosa, they are of low grade. They're not serious tumors. They can be managed by preserving the bladder. Whereas if the tumor starts to invade the lamina propria or the detrusor muscle or the perivesical fat, or if it invades adjacent organs, the chances of saving the bladder becomes difficult. Next, coming on to the urachus. Urachus is the anterior superior attachment of the bladder to the umbilicus. Embryologically, this was the allantois. After birth, this urachus obliterates usually. If it has failed to obliterate and then close, then it can be a source of urine leak and recurrent urinary tract infection. This again can be partially open or completely open. If it is partially open, it can develop cyst. The urachus remnant urachus can also be a source of adenocarcinoma of the bladder. Next is interesting function of the detrusor muscle. Generally, according to physics, when volume increases, the pressure also increases. but detrusor muscle is designed in such a way that when there is distension of the filling of the urinary bladder, it distends in such a way that there is no increase in pressure of the bladder. Now, this rise in volume is without rise in pressure, but if there is failure of detrusor muscle compliance, then it leads to vesicoureteric reflex and the damage of kidney. Coming to the intramural portion of the ureter, intramural portion is the one that perforates the detrusor muscle to enter the bladder. The intramural portion of the ureter is strongly fixed by the detrusor muscle and the Waldeyer sheath. This aids when the filling of bladder happens. When the bladder fills, there is compression effect on the ureter. This also prevents reflex of urine back into the upper urinary tract. It's also an entry point. The entry point is also a point of weakness in the detrusor muscle and can be a source of formation of Hutch diverticulum. Also, the longer the intramural portion of the ureter, there is a lesser chance of patient developing a reflex. Coming to the blood supply and lymphatics of bladder, the blood supply is mainly from the superior and inferior vesical arteries, which are all branches of the internal iliac artery. The veins drain along the internal iliac vein. Lymphatic drainage, largely it drains into the external iliac lymph nodes, and there is little drainage into the internal iliac and obturator lymph nodes. There is significant cross drainage present in the in bladder. So in a bladder cancer patient, when you remove the bladder, you always end up doing bilateral lymphadenectomy irrespective of the site of the tumor. Coming to the bladder innervation, bladder has high density of parasympathetic cholinergic nerve endings and relatively less sympathetic innervation. The sympathetic innervation, which arises from T10 to L2 via the hypogastric nerve, aids in relaxation of the bladder, whereas the parasympathetic innervation, which arises from the S2 to S4, aids in contraction of the bladder. So usually what happens is there's a constant sympathetic tone keeping the bladder relaxed, letting it to fill up. Once the bladder is filled up sufficiently, there is impulse sent to the Pontine micturition center, and the Pontine micturition center sends a command down to the sacral micturition center, and via the pelvic nerve, you have the parasympathetic impulses transmitted. This aids in strong contraction of detrusor muscle and the cessation of the sympathetic tone. There is relaxation of the bladder neck, and the pudendal nerve is also instructed to open the external urethral sphincter, and there is passage of urine. So coming to the last portion of the renal system, urethra. The normal urethral diameter is around 8 to 9 millimeters. It is classified broadly into anterior urethra and posterior urethra. What is anterior urethra is what is distal to the perineal membrane, and the posterior urethra is present from the perineal membrane to the bladder neck. The urethral epithelium is transitional epithelium proximally, that is, when it extends from the bladder, the prostate and the part of membranous urethra is lined by transitional epithelium. Then most of the urethra that is contained within the spongiosum has pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and the distal most portion, that is in the fossa navicalis, you have the squamous epithelium. So the posterior urethra is the prostatic urethra and the membranous urethra, and the perineal membrane, like we said, divides the urethra into anterior urethra. Anterior urethra is again divided into bulbar urethra. This is the bulbar urethra up to the point where the suspensor ligament of the penis is attached. From there on, you have the pendulous urethra or the penile urethra, and the terminal portion is called as fossa navicularis. This is how the orientation of urethra happens. If you take a cross section at this level, the urethra is usually present close to the dorsal aspect, and as you go down, it comes down to the ventral aspect, and more or less opens in the ventral point in the glans penis. This is a cystoscopic image of the urethra. This is how your fossa navicularis looks, and this is the penile urethra. This is the bulbar urethra, and the mucosal folds are usually seen at the level of external sphincter. And then you have your verum montanum, and then you have the lateral lobes of prostate, and this is the bladder neck, and then you enter the bladder. This is how we evaluate the urethra without doing a cystoscopy. This is called an ascending urethrogram. It again shows the penile urethra, the suspensory ligament holding the penis and giving it a S shape. Beyond this point, it is the bulbar urethra, and the distal end of the the inferior borders of the pubic ramus corresponds to midpoint of the bulbar urethra, and the inferior border of the pubic symphysis inferior border of the pubic ramus corresponds to inferior border of the obturator foramen corresponds to the bulbomembranous junction. Beyond this, you have your internal sphincter, and then you can see the radiopacity here with, of the verumontanum, and then you have the prostatic urethra, and then you have jet sign of contrast entering the bladder. Coming to urethra, the arterial supply is mainly from the internal pudendal artery, the bulbourethral branch of the internal pudendal artery, and the venous drainage is from the pudendal plexus, which drains into the internal pudendal vein. The lymphatic drainage is into the internal iliac veins and the common iliac vein. Internal iliac nodes and the common iliac nodes. So the first portion of the urethra is known as the prostatic urethra. It makes a 35-degree turn anteriorly at the midpoint of the prostate. You have your verumontanum present in the midpoint of the urethra, which is formed by the widening and protrusion of the urethral crest. It has the opening of the prostatic utricle, which is the male remnant of the vagina, and then you have the ejaculatory ducts opening on the either side on the verumontanum. It is the widest and most distensible part of the urethra. Next comes with relation to prostatic urethra, you have the applied anatomy, which is the benign prostatic hypertrophy. This is how normal urethra looks. The prostatic urethra looks. When there is benign prostatic enlargement, there is occlusion of the prostatic urethra, rendering elderly males to have difficulty in voiding and controlling urine. This is usually surgically treated by transurethral resection of the lateral lobes, transurethral resection of the prostate. Also, the angle that we were talking earlier is around 30 to 35 degrees. But in a patient with the BPH, this angle can be increased acutely, and this may lead to formation of false passage in the urethra while attempting catheterization. So gentle perineal compression can be done in a case of difficult catheterization to aid the catheter tip enter the bladder. Also, alternatively, a perrectal exam, perrectally, you can place a finger and lift the prostate up to obliterate this angle. Coming to the next portion, the membranous urethra. The membranous urethra is around 2 to 2.5 centimeters in length, and it runs over the external urethral sphincter. During prostatectomy, the prostate is removed, and the internal sphincter is usually destroyed during the procedure. The only source of continence for these patients is external urethral, the external sphincter. So injury to this level of urethra on the sphincter or the sphincter can cause the patient to become incontinent urine-wise. And it is also the most narrowest part and least distensible portion of the urethra. Coming to the anterior urethra is the urethra that is covered by the corpus spongiosum. It is also known as the pendulous urethra or sponge urethra. It is further divided into a bulbar urethra and the bulbar urethra and the penile urethra by the suspensory hello. So it is further divided by the suspensory ligament of the penis. The bulbar urethra begins few centimeters distal to the membranous urethra and extends distally to the level of suspensory ligament. Next, you have your urethral disruption. Urethral disruption usually occurs at a junction between the membranous urethra and the bulbar urethra. This segment is known as the bulbourethral segment. This is roughly around 2 centimeters of the bulbomembranous segment of the urethra passes through the urogenital diaphragm. This is a fixed portion of the urethra. Any trauma, especially during a pelvic fracture, the rest of the other, the unfixed portion of the urethra, because of the distraction, detaches from the fixed portion, and this causes disruption of the urethra. Next, coming on to the urethral glands. there are two glands. One is the Cowper's gland, which is at the level of external sphincter. This drains on the bulbar urethra on the either sides, and then along the length of penile urethra, you have glands, Litter's glands, which empty into the urethra. These can again, if these glands get infected, a patient can develop stricture of the urethra. Coming to the final portion of the urethra, which is the fossa navicularis. The fossa navicularis is again dilated segment of the terminal urethra, proximal to the external urethral meatus. This segment of urethra is lined by squamous epithelium, and it is a common site to develop stricture or stricture post catheterization or instrumentation. With relation to the external meatus, hypospadias is again a very common congenital urological abnormality where the urethral opening is present on the ventral surface of the penis. It can be present as a glandular hypospadias or a penile hypospadias or penoscrotal hypospadias or scrotal hypospadias. With this, we end the applied anatomy lecture of renal system. If anybody has any queries, you can always contact me by sending me an email at jagadish.urologist@gmail.com. Thank you. Hello?
Srinath sir, hello.
It was a great honor to hear your lecture, Dr. Jagdish. It was very nice.
Thank you.
So, any questions, Avik? We will be ready to take. Any questions, you can put it in your chat box. Already many have messaged. It's an excellent presentation. It's very nice, Dr. Jagdish.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
If there are no questions, thank you very much. We'll meet in the next session in the next Tuesday at the same time. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Have a nice day.
Thank you, sir.